Morning, everyone, and welcome to this second EDLab webinar. In today's case, following our introductory webinar some weeks ago, the webinar is dealing with the accreditation of joint programs, current practices, and future perspectives. It is a very great pleasure for me as coordinator of the Arqus European University Alliance and of the EDLab Policy Experimentation Project on the European degree label to welcome you all to this session. And I would like to give special thanks to our speakers from ministries and quality assurance agencies around Europe for participating. The accreditation of joint programs is an issue which faces challenges at various different levels, at institutional level, at regional level, at national level, and at European level. We see how in our initial survey, only 18% of the joint programs who have responded to our survey actually have joint degrees in the formal definition of joint degree. And we see also how this has occurred in the Erasmus Mundus program. And we would like to look at the current situation and see future perspectives as we move forward. So as I said, thank you very, very much for being here. The agenda today consists basically of four parts. The first is an introduction by Laura Howard, who is a coordinator of the CEU Alliance, working at the University of Cadiz in Spain. And then the second part of the webinar will be taken up with presentations of the current context in the 4 target countries with which we are working in EDLab, that is France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, in strict alphabetical order. Each of the countries will be represented either by the ministry or by the quality assurance agency. And then we will have a look at the European approach for the quality assurance of joint programs with a speaker from INVAL, from the Dutch Flemish Quality Assurance Agency, with considerable experience in the field. And of course, finally, your opportunity to participate in a question and answer session. We will ask you, thank you, Alessandra. I think, introduce each speaker as they take the floor. And for questions and answers, please, as I'm sure you're used to by now, use the question and answer box in your Zoom screen to direct questions in writing to our panelists and the team at the University of Padua, whom I would like to thank for all the organization of this webinar. Will direct the questions to the panel. Please feel free to use the chat box, as you can see also, to introduce yourselves, to discuss topics amongst yourselves. As you know, you have both a private and a more public option there. The webinar is being recorded and will be available following the event on the EDLab YouTube channel. So thank you all very much for that. And without further ado, I would like to ask Laura Howard, representing the CEU Alliance, as I said, from the University of Cadiz in Spain, to introduce some of the issues that we would like to discuss today.
Thank you, Dorothy, and good morning to you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I'd like to thank my colleagues from the Arqus Alliance for inviting me to give the introduction to this webinar. I'd also like to point out that there was a slight mistake on the first slide. I'm not the coordinator of the CEU Alliance. My colleague, Professor Fidel Echevarria, has that honour. I'm the General Director of the Alliance. Okay, so I was asked to start off this second EDLab webinar by giving an introduction to the context from the perspective of accreditation, to set the scene before giving the floor to our main speakers. And I'm going to be very brief for two reasons. Firstly, because I'd like to give as much time as possible to our guest speakers. It's not every day that we get representatives from national ministries and evaluation and accreditation agencies around the screen, and also to give as much time as possible to the questions and debate that will follow, and which will no doubt be very enriching. The second reason for being fairly brief is that, as those of you who have already seen it know, the first EDLab webinar gave a very interesting and comprehensive overview of the overall policy objectives, the call to pilot the joint European degree label that EDLab responded to, and the EDLab project itself. And indeed, my presentation this morning is based on that webinar. For those of you who would like more information on those aspects, I would invite you to see the recording of that first webinar, which is available online. Maybe our colleagues from Padua could put that in the link to that in the chat for anyone who would like it. So to introduce this webinar, I'm sure you'll all agree that we are in an evolving, changing context that's characterized by an intensification of transnational cooperation. And the European University Alliance's initiative is a clear example of this, and in many ways is spearheading the transformation of the higher education sector in Europe. Now, those of us in the 44 alliances are traveling along a rather bumpy road, or should I say, in the context of the CU Alliance that my university coordinates, we're sailing on some fairly rough seas. As you can see on the slide, 92% of universities have identified the elimination of legal and administrative obstacles as a key issue to effectively engage in transnational cooperation. And of course, joint programs are very often a key part of that cooperation. And when you're setting up a joint program, especially one with several partner institutions, you're not only dealing with the obstacles that may be present in your own national context or your institutional context, the challenges are multiplied. And what is an obstacle for one partner is an obstacle for everyone. For many of the barriers that exist, we need solutions at a European level. And yet many of the tools created at European level, many of them through the Bologna process, for precisely that purpose, to bring down some of the barriers, particularly those related to quality assurance and accreditation, have not been successfully implemented across the European Union and need to be resolved at national level in many partner countries. If we could move to the next slide, please. To look more specifically at some of the challenges related to the development and delivery of joint programs, and in the context of the topic of our webinar today, we can mention significant differences in quality assurance procedures in different national contexts, often meaning that a single joint program has to undergo several accreditation procedures. And then once a program is accredited, the timescale for the validity of the program can vary significantly from one partner to another. In addition, any changes that need to be made in the program may require re-accreditation by some partner universities and not by others. There are also differences regarding the use of ex-ante versus ex-post accreditation, which has an obvious effect on the implementation of a joint program, as does institutional accreditation versus program accreditation. We should also mention the existence in some national contexts of limitations on the possibility to use quality assurance agencies from other countries, and of course limitations on the use of the European approach, which will be discussed later in this webinar. So many obstacles indeed, some of which the alliances involved in the EDLab project hope will be addressed as a result of the work carried out in these 6 projects that have been approved to pilot a joint European degree label. If you could move to the next slide, please. So why have these 4 alliances, Arqus, Enlight, Utopia and CU, come together in this EDLab project to pilot a joint European degree label? Why did we decide to answer the call and submit an application? In this very quick look of key information on the project, we can see that we have diverse associate partners, and I'd like to focus here on the national ministries and quality assurance agencies, who are a very important part of this project. It is vital to have these institutions on board with us and working together with us to explore the challenges and help to find ways to dismantle the existing barriers, many of which only they can tackle. As you can see, the main objective is to further the implementation of European and international joint programs and to experiment with and pilot the European degree label with 4 target countries, which, as you can see, are the ones that are represented in our speakers this morning: France, Italy, Portugal and Spain. If you could move to the next slide, please. I think it's worth looking at the specific objectives of the call that EDLab successfully participated in. And the term to perhaps focus on here is criteria, because the call includes a list of proposed criteria for awarding a joint European degree label. And we are testing those criteria, participating in the co-creation process, as well as piloting the design and issue of a joint European degree label. And if you can move forward to the next slide. On this slide and the following slide, we have a rather long list of the criteria that have been included in this process. And these criteria are related to the higher education institutions involved, to transnational joint degree delivery, to the transparency of learning outcomes, to being a transnational campus with access to services, to flexible and embedded student mobility arrangements, multilingualism, if you could move the slide forward, please, innovative learning approaches, graduate outcomes, and inclusiveness and sustainability. But I'd like to focus on 2 criteria that are particularly relevant for our webinar today. The first is quality assurance arrangements. And if you could move forward to the next slide, you can see the details of the proposed criteria. Internal and external quality assurance is conducted in accordance with the European standards and guidelines. The program, the study field, or the institutions are accredited or evaluated by an ECHA registered agency. And if external quality assurance is required at program level in the countries involved, then the transnational program should be accredited or evaluated, preferably using the European approach for quality assurance of joint programs. And another relevant criteria, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, but still relevant for our audience and our topic today, is related to joint policies for the joint program. And this states that the universities, the higher education institutions involved, should have joint policies for admission, selection, supervision, monitoring, assessment, and recognition procedures for the joint study program. Now, many of the elements included here depend on national or regional legislation, and we rely on the authorities to support us in identifying and eliminating the barriers that hinder the development of these necessary elements of joint programs. In the context of these criteria, this general context that I've been describing, it's very relevant to hear from the ministries and evaluation and accreditation agencies that are with us this morning about current practices and future perspectives related to the accreditation of joint programmes in their countries. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope that this has given a sufficient introduction and background to the topic, and I would like to hand back to Dorothy for the next part of the webinar.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura, for that, I think, very clear contextualization of our discussion. And without further ado, I think we should move on to the core of the webinar today, and that is presentations from the various national contexts. And as I said, in strict alphabetical order, we're starting with France. And I would like to welcome Sarah Thornton, Université Paris-Cité, conseillère scientifique au ministère de l'Enseignement supérieur et de la Recherche. Sarah is going to be presenting also, I believe, the national context in France with the participation. We also have the participation of Benjamin Dago, Head of European Affairs at HCRS. But the presentation, if we have understood correctly, will be made by Sarah. So Sarah, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to discuss this question, which we've been looking at in a variety of contexts in France recently. And of course, to pick up on everything that Laura was saying, we've been looking very much at the importance of the Alliance in bringing down barriers. So obviously, like all countries, recently there have been adjustments and openings up to new ways of doing things. So today, very briefly, I'll be looking at different questions. So the recognition of diplomas, and then perhaps two particular French questions of recognition that it's interesting for everyone to think about. Thirdly, I'll be looking at the main criteria for national diplomas, because we have a distinction in France between national diplomas and equivalents, what we call a grade, which is when universities or schools who don't usually have the right to produce a national diploma will apply for a equivalent level. So there are different criteria also in those two distinct forms. Fourthly, we'll be looking at the European approach and the add-on additional French criteria. And then, of course, we'll be going on to look at this question of procedures for accreditation and for the attribution of the grade or master's degree level. And then lastly, a few points on the setting up of a degree and whether it's joint or not, and how those might create a problem, but increasingly will be more flexible. Okay, next slide, please. So first of all, this recognition of diplomas. So obviously we have in France the LMD system, which is of course licence, which is the first degree, then master's, then doctorate. So 3 years, 2 years, 3 years. And these have the same, a specific number of ECTS. And that is very much an important point to take into account, because the timescales of these diplomas are very important. And then, of course, we have our quality assurance agency, which is the HCERS. And this really is an agency which, like other agencies in Europe, is a high council and which is an independent public authority. And so it has a hugely important and central role in France in saying, what are the criteria, what are the ways in which we need to choose and to really scrutinize our diplomas. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So two things that very particular to France are the capped low fees. As you know, it's one of the least expensive systems in Europe. So for a first degree, what we call a licence, it's 170 euros. On top of that, students may pay a little bit of health insurance, etc. But it's very, very low indeed, especially in comparison with places like the UK and also other EU countries in Europe. We have, this is part of the French Constitution. It's very important, and it's a real principle which is very dear to us in France. Having said that, there is possibilities of creating diplomas which are unregulated in terms of tuition fees. That is, institutions can apply to, they can create a diploma which can be independent of this fee capping. And this is something which is often done with what we used to call the professionalizing programs, where there's a selectivity, quite a high selectivity. So again, these creations of diplomas, which are not national diplomas, but equivalent levels, give a certain amount of freedom, give us a certain amount of leeway, but they do obviously still undergo ministry scrutiny. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So here we have the main criteria for awarding a national licence, which is the first degree. So what we see here is that, in fact, nothing varies very much until we get to the bottom of the list. And there we have that the fixed tuition fees will, there are certain fixed tuition fees that will vary. And also we can see that there's no need in the equivalent level, as I said before, for this fixed fees. And then at the bottom, you'll see this question that has created a lot of problems for everyone. That is the printing of the diploma and what can be on the diploma. That is flexible if it's not a national degree. So if every university creates these special levels, equivalent levels, or try to. It's not as easy as all that, but they can then waive these problems of the printing of the diploma. The next slide, please. So we then have the same questions with the masters. It's basically a similar question and similar ways in which the national diploma is the same as or differs from the equivalent level masters. Adaptations can be made in terms of the printing, same as the licence, but this is of course the masters. The next one, please. Here we have these two additional criteria, which is really worth bearing in mind, is that the French government takes into account two very important criteria. One is the link to research, that there has to be sufficient teaching staff who are lecturers, researchers. There has to be links with research laboratories, and of course, initiation of students to research practices. So this means that when diplomas and any kind of course is evaluated, these things will be taken into account. So as I say at the bottom, the European approach is not sufficient to accredit an institution to deliver a national degree or to award the French grade. So these things have to be taken into account. I have the next slide, please. And here we have the procedures for accreditation to award a national licence or master's degree or the equivalent level. And it's here we need to take into account timings, timetables. These can differ. You can see that in terms of the duration of the process, an equivalent level grade is perhaps shorter than the national diploma, and that there is also perhaps more flexibility on the rolling basis in terms of this kind of fixed timetable of setting up the accreditation. The next slide, please. Here also some little points about criteria which are increasingly flexible. So the number of ECTS, of course, can be adjusted for students, for particular students who need more ECTS. And it's something that has worked quite well already in France with a certain number of alliances. Then we have this, the joint degree tuition fees. There can be more flexibility in creating what I've called a personal to institution degree. So again, an equivalent level degree gives a little bit more flexibility. And in terms of the printing of diploma, I won't go into too much detail here, but it can be done, but it has to be done manually. It's quite tricky still. As we all know, that's the moment when perhaps one of the most important things that needs to be regulated among the different countries. So it's part of a French law in terms of the national printing press, which go back a long time, and part of the constitution. But again, this can be got round by a little bit of sort of extra work, as is always the case. So the next slide, please. Well, I've come to the end of my presentation. I'll be very happy to try to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that, I think, quite detailed presentation of the current situation in France. And we had a very interesting opportunity a few days ago to have bilateral exchange of situation and state of the art between French and Spanish universities participating in alliances. And we would like to thank you for the participation of the ministry and the agency in that event, which I think was very, very useful for all of us. Thank you. And we move on now in our alphabetical order to Italy. And I would like to welcome Marilena Magnacci, who is a member of the General Council of ANVUR, the Quality Assurance Agency for the evaluation of the university system, and the research system in Italy. Marilena, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I apologize because my voice is not at its best. And I also apologize because of not having a presentation. I wasn't sure whether I should have prepared one, but I'll try to be clear in shortly describing the Italian system and the progresses which are being made towards the implementation of an international European approach to the accreditation of joint programs, and more generally to the evaluation, to the assessment of the work which is being done within the alliances. So thank you very much for inviting us as ANVUR, for organizing this webinar on the current state and challenges posed by the accreditation of joint courses. The initial presentation was very clear. I very much appreciated it for setting the framework, and also very much appreciated this initiative of bringing all the main actors, main stakeholders around the same tables. As some of you already know, ANVUR strongly supports this process, the development of the alliances and implementation of common rules and approaches to their quality assurance. And this is the reason why we participated as associated partner to 3 of the networks which applied to these Erasmus Plus call for the attribution, for the allowance, for the label, for the joint courses. And we are now involved in 3 of the projects that have been selected. So EDFish, EDLab, and SMART. And it will be interesting to contribute for us. And we also think it will be very interesting to to make an effort for networking, for coordination also among the different projects and participating Italian university. This is something that we think it is needed, and we as ANVUR, we also want to promote this possibility. Just a few words about the Italian system. I'll summarize for those who are not familiar with the Italian quality assurance system, the main activity that ANVUR has in this field. Starting, we do both initial and periodic accreditation at both an institutional and a program level. So we have initial accreditation of new universities, which are periodically allowed to apply by the ministry within its 3-year periodic programming. So new university cannot always be funded. It depends on the ministry that has to allow this possibility. And following conditions have to be met, which are verified by ANVUR. The first one is ongoing multi-year research activity. As in France, we put a very strong accent on the interaction between higher education and research. Then the proposed study programs must not already be delivered at short distance. They must not be represented in a satisfactory way at national level. And the new initiative has to guarantee financial, logistical, and scientific sustainability. And the ministry quite rarely allows candidature for new universities. 8 applications were evaluated in the last 3 years, and none of them was accepted. They all received a negative assessment. Accreditation is always allowed by the ministry, but it has to be compliant with ANVUR decisions. So this is the general framework. Then we have initial accreditation of new study programs. Study programs are defined according to a quite rigid framework of study program classes, which has been made more flexible in recent years by the ministry. This is also important, as we have heard already for France. Flexibility is necessary if we want to do some steps forwards in these European alliances and joint program initiatives. But we do, as ANVUR, we also do initial accreditation of new study programs. That is, we evaluate them, because then accreditation is granted by the ministry after the assessment by ANVUR, in compliance with the assessment by ANVUR. And when we do initial accreditation of new study programs every year, we have every year between 200 and 250 new programs. We look at the overall quality of the project. We look again at the number and qualification of scientific staff and scientific and teaching staff. Again, we look both at higher education and research. And the evaluation is carried out every year, as I said, by panels of ANVUR disciplinary, student, and system, and then specific experts for online courses. And then, as a third aspect, we have periodic assessment of both universities and their study programs, which also include PhD programs. Periodic accreditation of universities has a 5-year duration, and the accreditation of study programs has a 3-year duration. Again, it is granted by the ministry following our proposals, and we look at the same quality requirements that we had checked in the occasion of the initial accreditation of study programs, but we add, of course, other requirements which are concerned with the strategies of the universities in the field of teaching, again, also in the field of research, and in the field of their mission and administration. We look at the programming and managing of resources. We look at the structure of the QA system and the quality of teaching and services offered to the students. We ended up with first cycle of periodic assessment in 2022. We revised the protocols, and we are now starting the second cycle from 2023. This as for the general framework. We as AMBUR, we are aware that internationalization is has a growing importance in the landscape of higher education, and that this brings the need for the development of a review and an adaptation of evaluation methods. The system has to be accompanied on the path of international openness. This means for Italy, on the one side, a revision of the current framework, of the current definition of international study programs. This has to be done by the Ministry. We have for now, according to Italian legislation, a multifaceted and quite problematic definition of international study program, but we working for its revision together with the Ministry. We are constructing a network. We are working in order to build really a dialogue between all the actors of the system, which are in Italy, the Ministry, the Conference of Rector, the agency, and also the National Center for the Recognition of Diplomas. Alliances can play, of course, a very important role in this perspective, firstly because cooperation that they develop doesn't have as its sole objective, and sometimes not as its main objective, the implementation of study programs. And the initiatives also involve, they're often born on a fertile ground of collaborations that include also research, student mobility, and social commitment, which is very important for AMBUR. As I said, AMBUR's approach to quality assurance is a holistic one, and it includes higher education and research and third mission at the same time. As you know, we have 27 Italian universities involved in alliances. That puts Italy at the 4th place after Germany, France, and Spain. And the figures are also probably will also grow in the near future. And the current governing board to which I belong is then trying to really progress in the direction of fit-for-purpose quality assurance framework that really is able to take into account the international development of the system at the European level. We have obstacles as AMBUR. The first one is that the current legislative framework does not allow us to recognize activities or decisions made by other quality assurance bodies. The second one is that we cannot make decisions based on assessments conducted by other agencies. And we cannot evaluate, accredit, or audit higher education institutions or programs offered in other countries, with the exception of branches of Italian universities operating abroad. This is actually not really impossible, but currently the problem is that we are not yet included in the ECHA register of agency authorized to operate at a European level. The reason is mainly that the Italian higher education system is a very complex one. It has 2 branches. On the one side, the universities, on the other side, higher education institutions in the field of arts and music. And these institutions are not yet ruled by comprehensive quality assurance frameworks, but step forwards have been made, and we will submit our application. We are submitting our application now, and we will be evaluated again at the beginning of next January. In the meantime, we are preparing ourselves with several measures. So I'll just make some points and then end my short presentation. First of all, we are working towards the internationalization of our AMBUR register of expert evaluators, which is not very easy since our evaluations are led in Italian, our documents are in Italian, but since a couple of years, we really open to international experts. We translate all our course into English, and we also promote the application by international experts. We also are introducing Italian experts into European approach procedures. So just yesterday, I was talking to an expert who is participating to a panel, and this is very interesting, of course, for us to look at the procedure concretely in its doing, and also to teach our experts, to train our experts also to use concretely the European approach. We are also doing an effort in the direction of training of our staff members, of our under officers already. They participated into staff mobility initiatives, which were mainly based on learning how to handle the European approach and to work in this European context. And there will be also 2 of our officials who will participate again to a training at the end of June, organized by German agency. And we are also intensifying very much our connections, our dialogue with the other European agencies. One of our governing board members, actually myself, is also included into the Arqus College. That means that we really have connections, direct connections to the other international actors. And we're quite confident that this will help in the near future also to address the topic of the European evaluation and accreditation of joint programs. There's, of course, a second topic which we're also looking to, which is less simple to implement, and it needs, according to our vision, a more gradual approach, which is the proposal of a common European framework for the evaluation of all the alliance activities. We think that the path taken already by some of the alliances, which is a bottom-up approach, the building of an internal quality assurance framework, system and procedures based on the synthesis of the systems in use in the different countries and systems, is a very good one. We think it is very productive. We have participated also into the unique project, and we hope that we will be able to contribute to the further discussion on the rethinking and updating of this framework. This is what we are currently doing. We're confident that this is a difficult path, but it is an important one. It is a priority for the agency in the next years, and we will be very happy to contribute together with the other countries and with all the actors to the creation of a real European training and research area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marilena. Thank you for the effort with your voice. I hope you're okay and wish you a speedy recovery. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the agencies and ministries who have agreed to act as associate partners in the EDLab project, precisely because the dialogue and working together is absolutely essential if we are to move forward. Thank you very much indeed for that. And we move on now from Italy to Portugal. Portugal is represented here by Artur Santoalla, Deputy to the Secretary of State for Higher Education at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Higher Education, and by Patricia Pereira from A3ES, the Portuguese Agency for Evaluation and Accreditation of Higher Education. And it is Patricia who is going to take the floor to present the Portuguese context. Thank you very much, Patricia. Over to you.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Dorothy. Good morning to all. It's with great pleasure that A3ES is here to talk to you about the national context for accreditation of joint programs. So we are also an associate partner of EAD project. And to give me, I'm not going to make any presentations, just have a small talk just to set the scene actually, or nowadays in Portugal. So A3ES makes accreditations of new study programs in operation, and institutions higher education institutions. For study programs in operation and institutions, the accreditation is valid for 6 years. So every 6 years, we have another evaluation exercise for these two kind of programs, processes, institutional and study programs in operation. Every year, we open calls for new study programs. And it's based on that joint programs come into the scene. So the way that Portuguese authorities and higher education legislation has been going so far, it has been a slow progress, because only in 2016 the Portuguese legislation has allowed the A3ES to be able to integrate in the process of assessment accreditations results of other agencies that also follow the European higher education quality assurance principles. So that was in 2016. In 2021, some paragraphs were added to the legislation stating that in such associated, in this case, joint programs, the institutions, the participating institutions, are not obliged to fulfill the teaching staff criteria. So we have national teaching staff criteria, and in such cases of joint programs, they don't have to be fully complied with. We can have lower percentages to accept the joint programs. Also, we also have such participating institutions do not have also to comply with the general requisites for accreditation, namely resources, facilities, non-academic staff. So we are a little bit more flexible when it comes to requisites for accreditation. Following this, last November, A3ES has signed its very first commitment letter with Unibasque, so the Basque University System Quality Agency, for the accreditation of one joint program, a master program in marine sciences. And so that was the first commitment, the very first commitment letter of A3ES. This April, I'm so sorry, I'm just going to have a sip of water. Sorry. So this April, A3ES Management Board published in the official journal a deliberation that states the procedure for accreditation of joint programs. And this deliberation says that the European approach will be followed always, if possible. Also, we have deadlines, specific deadlines for the submission of processes, whether they be institutional, study programs in operation, or new study programs. They are defined. In case of joint programs, the agency is flexible for the submission, the electronic submission of such requests. This can be aligned with the deadlines also of the funding agencies. Next, so the evaluation procedure of joint programs has to be done by an agency, as we all know, that is registered in EDLab. And this agency might be responsible whether by accreditation of study programs or institutions. When A3ES is a partner in the process of evaluation, the procedure is we, A3ES, will sign a commitment letter with a leading agency saying that all the phases of the procedure will be respected, namely the final decision. So this is the legal framework. Our current situation is that we received this month the results of accreditation of the commitment letter that we've signed with Unibasq. So the agency is ready, the management board is ready to take a decision on that master science in marine sciences. Also, we do have 5 joint programs submitted electronically. A3ES is not the leading agency, so we will be partners. Some of these processes are waiting for the results of the other agencies to be uploaded in our system, and others are ready actually for the management board to take a decision. We do also have one joint program in which A3ES will be the leading agency. So we might ask, what is stopping A3ES from fully embrace or follow the European approach? Well, it's a question of fine-tuning the national requirements with the possibility to upload the self-assessment report, the self-evaluation report in our platform. So we are working on that because in Portugal, it is, we are obliged to publish in the official journal, the curricular structure and the study plan. So if a consortium is able to upload its SIR, well, they have to follow, or they have to fill the curricular structure and the study plan. And there's not a way to go around that. So that's it. We are working actually on that process, having that component of national legislation, and also giving the opportunity to the SIR to be uploaded in our system. So for today, that is what I had prepared. And I'll be happy to answer your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Patricia, again, for that very detailed information. And as we can see, a lot of movement, a lot of detail being addressed so that we can all move forward together. Thank you very much indeed. And we move on to the 4th national context, which is that of Spain. And Spain will be represented in this webinar by the Undersecretary for Universities at the Ministry of Universities, Arqus González Beifus. Arqus, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dorothy. And first of all, thank you for inviting us to this very interesting EDLab webinar. The Ministry of Universities, the Spanish Ministry of Universities, is also an associate partner of this project and of other projects that are within the pilots of the European label and also the legal status of European universities. And we do so because I think it's not only to bring our information, our criteria to the projects, but also because I think it's very interesting also to learn from other partners, from other ministries. I think, therefore, I would also thank you very much for this opportunity, for this dialogue, also with other member states, because I think Laura said this in the introductory words. all these issues of accreditation and of higher education in general are still a competence of member states to a great extent. And therefore, we need to talk a lot, to learn a lot, and to find our ways to be flexible, because otherwise it's completely impossible that our systems become really international or really European. So therefore, I think this opportunity also, like the opportunity with the other day in Madrid with the French authorities, I think it's vital that also member states we dialogue, we learn, and we know our systems in order to contribute and to exchange also good practices or problems. No? So thank you for this opportunity. So my presentation will be very short, and it's focused on the accreditation of joint programs. But I would like to start with a very general approach, because all member states have different constitutional structures, and this is also important when we talk about accreditation systems. In our case, as you know, Spain, the central government or the central institutions are competent for the legislation of the university system and also for the legislation regarding accreditation. But we have then national and nowadays 10 regional quality assurance agencies. So we have a system with different agencies, most of them registered in EQUAR. Second important information, we passed 2 months ago or 3 months ago a new law on the university system. And here I would like to highlight 3 essential principles that I think are important for all countries, or at least for us, because they try to break the traditional rigidity or problems in order to how to face these problems. No? First of all is this Article 25 of the law that states that the government and also universities, and I think this is also important, universities also, but also the public administration, they have the duty to foster, but also to facilitate the creation and participation of university alliances. And the same applies in the next article to joint degrees, this duty to foster and facilitate. And I emphasize this idea of facilitate, because facilitate means we need to be flexible, because otherwise it's not possible to facilitate all these joint programs or university alliances. Another important general principle of the law is that it states that in Spain, all agencies in the whole university system have to follow the European quality assurance standards, and that the decisions of agencies that are of other countries that are registered in EQUAR need to be recognized. This is also very important for the whole system. So these are, I think, 3 principles, 3 very general principles, but are nowadays in Spain legally binding. No? The problem, of course, is how do we facilitate? But I think it's a very important general approach that I would like to underline. It's all a mandate for the government, so for the administrations, national and regional administrations, but also for universities, because we also know that within universities, there are also obstacles or sometimes very rigid criteria when it comes to implement regulations. So next slide, please. So this was the legal framework and very, I think, new framework. But these criteria, this general criteria, we are trying to implement them since some years ago. And I would say also thanks or because of the pressure of universities that were members of the University Alliances. You know that Spanish universities are very active, very proactive in this process, but also from other universities that pressured the ministry also to change this mentality. And therefore it was in 2021, so a couple of years ago, when we passed a new regulation on the quality assurance proceedings. It's a royal decree, it's not a law, but a regulation of the government, where the most important idea that I wanted to share with you today is that in this decree, there are special provisions regarding international joint degrees, in the framework of the European University Initiatives, and special regulations also regarding Erasmus Mundus joint degrees. So we have different rules, to some extent different rules for these three different joint degrees. In the first case, international joint degrees, the regulation applies always when there are a minimum of 2 higher education institutions. While in the case of the joint degrees in the framework of the European Union Universities Initiatives, the requirement is that there are a minimum of 3 higher education institutions. Next slide, please. So which are these special provisions or special rules that apply to this international joint degrees? And here I try to, this applies more or less generally to all these three cases that I mentioned before. Well, first of all, the special provisions applies to the quality assurance system. Second, to the number of ECTS of these joint degrees. This is also gives flexibility to the Spanish regulation. This is quite rigid in this extent. And third, and also I think quite important, in these cases, the university agreements within the universities that take part in these joint degrees, the content of these university agreements can affect some issues that I will mention afterwards. So first of all, the quality assurance system, the specialty of these national joint degrees. Here, what is, I think, important taking into account was already mentioned in other presentations. Here, the principle is that the Spanish system, the Spanish rules, recognize the evaluations of quality assurance agencies of other member states if these agencies are registered in EQUAR. Second special rule that applies to these joint degrees, the possibility, not the duty, but the possibility of using the European approach in this evaluation process. And this is especially mentioned by the law. And also that the validity of the accreditation depends on the legislation of the country that coordinated the joint degree. Next slide, please. Regarding the second issue that I mentioned, the number of ECTS, here in these joint degrees, the number can differ from the national rule. This, in our case, is especially important because in Spain, the general rule for diplomas is 240 ECTS, which is not the case in most of the member states. So in these joint degrees, they can be shorter in terms of, and some of them are from 180 ECTS. So this gives also flexibility to these joint degrees. And third aspect that I wanted to also mention, in the case of joint degrees, the university agreements can rule in a different way from the normal principles in our case. These 4 issues that they are mentioned here. Academic fees, which is always an issue. And here we have always different approaches, national approaches. So this can be ruled in a different way in these agreements. The management of academic records, which is always a problem. Here the rule says that, of course, Spanish universities that are members of the consortium, they have to keep a copy of the records, but the management can be ruled by the agreements. Academic rules can also be part of these agreements. And the issue of the diploma and of the European supplement, how these are delivered and by the universities, by Spanish universities, can also differ from the national rules. And I think this is also a very interesting and flexibility element. because as has been already mentioned, here we have very different and rigid national regulations regarding this. No? We are precisely now at the Ministry working on the new regulation for joint degrees within the alliances, European alliances, trying to bring more flexibility and change some important rules regarding the diploma and what can be written within the diploma. Next rule, please. Next slide, please. And finally, and this was my last slide, I already mentioned that I wanted to be very, very short and brief, which is the implementations of this rule till today. Well, here I have only information regarding the diplomas or joint programs within the European Universities Initiative. So till now, we at the government, we have included and declared official 3 joint degrees. The first, the European Studies degree from Una Europa, where Universidad Complutense of Madrid is the Spanish partner. And this has been evaluated by ENVAU. The second is the Master in Marine Biotechnology, coordinated by EUCONEXUS, and the Spanish partner is Universidad Católica Valencia. And here, the agency that analyzed the quality assurance is Ceres from Romania. And the third is the Master of Arts in European Studies, coordinated by Arqus, where University of Granada is the coordinating institution. And here, the accreditation was issued by TEVA. I mean, these are the 3 processes that have been finished now. There are other cases that are in progress, but these are 3 results, 3 concrete cases of implementation of this rules that I tried to mention. It's interesting to see, well, interesting, I think it's significant to see that in the 3 cases, the agency that accredited it was not a Spanish one. So this is one of our challenges, when we talk also about challenges, so that also Spanish agencies, the National ANECA agency, but also some of the regionals that are registered with that ENQUA, use and accredit these joint degrees. This is one of the challenges that we as in the Spanish university system have. And this, I think it's the information I wanted to share in this first intervention. Thank you very much for your attention. Of course, I will be more than happy to participate in the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, also for a very interesting and very complete presentation, I think, of how Spanish legislation is evolving in order to facilitate joint programs, joint degrees. I think just to conclude this round, this part of our program, I would like to thank all 4 speakers. And again, I would like to express from EDLab and from Arqus our deep gratitude to all the quality assurance agencies and all the ministries represented here for your support over the years of the work that we're doing in joint programs. And I'm sure in the Q&A we'll come back to some of the details. But I think that the openness to dialogue and the openness to support us and accompany us on this complicated journey is very, very much appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. The European approach has come up, of course, in almost all the presentations. And I think it is certainly worthwhile as part of this webinar to showcase the European approach as an instrument which was developed indeed at European level to facilitate the accreditation processes of joint programs. And I'm very, very pleased to have here with us today Mark Fredericks, who is the coordinator for international policy at ENVAU, the Dutch-Flemish Quality Assurance Agency. And Mark, over to you, and thank you very much for your presentation on the European approach for quality assurance of joint programs.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation also here to present the European approach for quality assurance of joint programs. My agency is also an associate partner in this project, and also involved in 3 other European degree pilot projects. Yeah, so the European approach for quality assurance of joint programs, well, it has already been mentioned already in the introduction, the barriers and the quite long-lasting experiences with national accreditation, with multiple national accreditations, with sometimes contradictory criteria also, and also criteria that were not always suitable for joint programs. And so there have been, and that actually was already the case since the start of joint programs, and with the Erasmus Mundus joint programs. And over the years, there have been a number of European projects dealing with that and trying to solve that. For instance, the Joker project was one of these. And these have all inspired then also the European approach. Well, in all these Bologna process communiques of the ministers, this was mentioned then for quite some years, and that these barriers should be tackled. And then in 2014, the Bologna follow-up group asked an expert group, I was one of the members there, to come up with a European approach. And that was then finally adopted by the ministers of the European higher education area in Yerevan in May 2015. There's a link here where on the ECA website where you can find all the information also on the European approach. Next slide, please. So what is the essence? Well, there are European standards and procedures in the European approach according to the ESC. You can also see the link to the European standards and guidelines behind the standards. And yeah, it's not only linked to the European standards and guidelines, but of course the jointness, taking into account the jointness in these standards, that's and also in the procedure, is of course quite important. And there, as I already mentioned, the different European projects that were carried out inspired that also very much. And a lot of what is in these standards was also derived from those experiences. Then this procedure is being carried out by an agency that is listed in ECA, and that leads then to a decision by this agency, which then, it says at least in the European approach, should be accepted then in the other European higher education countries and by the other agencies. What is also important is that it is said in the European approach, and the first page in the introduction even, that these standards are set based on the agreed tools of the European higher education area without applying additional national criteria. So the idea being that these are not necessary, and because actually the standards are already quite comprehensive. Now, of course, that is an ideal, but and we heard already some examples where there are national criteria. But I think it is important still to keep this ideal, because, yeah, of course, if each country would add its own national criteria, then you would have a long list of criteria, which would defeat a bit the purpose of having a European approach. So I think it's still a work in progress to that extent. Next slide, please. Definitions are also given in the European approach of a joint program that then leads to a double or multiple degree or a joint degree. And these are also defined, double and multiple degrees. I think for us, the definition of joint degree is the most interesting now. So next slide, please. So it's a single document awarded by the higher education institutions offering the joint program and nationally acknowledged as the recognized award of the joint program. Now, of course, you can debate definitions a lot, and these are debated, and there are also other definitions, but I think it's important that the definition is given then that, that is included and that everyone can refer to, and what is important is that it's in a single document offering together by the higher education institutions, and then also the national acknowledgement of that and the recognition of that. Next slide, please. So the European approach can be applied in different systems. So if you have some of the higher education institutions that have program accreditation, are subject to program accreditation or evaluation, then these higher education institutions that form the joint program can select a quality assurance agency that's registered on ECA. At the moment, there are 55 agencies that are registered in ECA, so that's quite a lot. So there's a lot of choice, you could say. Of course, that doesn't mean that all the agencies have already carried out procedures according to the European approach, or some may not even be allowed to do that. Still there's a lot of choice, and it also means then, of course, that you can look at a suitable agency for your consortium. The agency then will use the standards and procedures in the European approach to carry out the single procedure of the entire joint program, and accept this decision then. The intention is that that is recognized in all the countries where the program is offered. It can also, of course, be used by self-accrediting higher education institutions, maybe also for improvement or enhancement purposes. And also if in a joint program consortium, countries outside of the European higher education area are included, then of course that is also a possibility, but of course they are not. But there's not an agreement as in Bologna for them. So that means that you also have to see whether they can also cooperate and also accept then the results of that for their country. Next slide, please. Yes. So there are 9 standards in total. I will just mention them briefly. First standard is on the eligibility, so that has to do with the status. Is it really possible to, for instance, if it is a joint degree that is awarded, is that possible legally to award that in all the participating countries? Is it also possible? Sometimes there are specific requirements also for institutions to participate in a joint program. That all needs to be clear in advance, because otherwise it is important to have the legal situation clearly stated from the beginning, so that the panel does not have to be confused about that. It's of course important that it is really delivered also and designed jointly. That is a cooperation agreement, and some elements of that are also mentioned in the standard. That there are intended learning outcomes on the appropriate level, whether it's a bachelor or master or a different level, according to the disciplinary field, that the achievement of these intended learning outcomes is demonstrated. And if there are special requirements, because it's a regulated profession, of course, that needs to be taken into account as well. Study program then, curriculum, credits, workload, admission and recognition, the learning and teaching processes, specifically for a joint program, and the assessment of students. Next slide, please. Student support, also for students who are mobile, resources, staff, facilities, transparency in documentation, that it's all clear what the students can expect, also at the different institutions and if they are mobile. And the quality assurance, where it says that they should be in line with part 1 of the European standards and guidelines. So that's something that all the institutions are expected to adhere to anyway. Next slide, please. Yeah, then the second part is the procedure. So the cooperating institutions should jointly select suitable agency that is listed in ECA. This can be, for instance, the agency of the coordinating institution, but it can also be another agency of a partner institution, or even an agency that is not that is from another country than in the consortium or in the alliance. Yeah, that's really up to the institutions to make that decision. What is important that the agency that then carries out the European approach procedure communicates this also with the competent national authorities of the countries of the joint programs, consortium alliance, because yeah, this is also important for the acceptance of the decisions that the national authorities know this already from the start that this is going on, and yeah, if necessary, can also be involved in that somehow. Next slide, please. So there are also 9 elements, different steps in the procedure relating to the self-evaluation report, that is written jointly also by the partners. The review panel, for instance, at least 4 experts and a student, also at least 2 members from the countries that are represented in the consortium and alliance. A site visit, which can be at one location, but with representation of all the different partner institutions. Review report that there is a formal outcome and the decision. The appeal system, well, which would follow the appeal system of the agency. Reporting, here it is said also in the European approach that of course you can have different languages in which the report is written. Sometimes there are national requirements also for that, but at least there should be a summary in English, and also the decision should be available in English. Yeah, this is also to make it possible to be accepted in the different countries. The follow-up procedure then, and the periodicity, so the validation of the accreditation decision, which is the European approach. It says this should be 6 years, and yeah, it's good to have indeed a common a common norm for the validation of an accreditation, because otherwise you end up with different validations of accreditation in different countries. So that's why 6 years is proposed. But of course, here there are also the legal realities in the different countries. But with 6 years, it is possible also to sometimes, for instance, you can then shorten an accreditation in one of the countries if there's a shorter accreditation procedure, a shorter accreditation term, you can come to an agreement then what is the most appropriate time for the evaluate for the procedure to take place, and for the different decisions then to be taken. But here there is still some, and the decision-making phase, we know that there are still some obstacles sometimes. Next slide, please. On the ECO website, you also see an overview of the national implementation of the European approach. So there are three categories, where one is where the European approach is available to all higher education institutions. That's the case in 17 countries. These are countries of the European higher education area. And then the European approach is available to some higher education institutions, or only under specific conditions, 11 countries, and not available to higher education institutions. It's 19 countries. So you see, it's quite mixed. The situation can change, of course, also. So I think it's also important, to regularly update this page, and also to inform EQA if you think that, for instance, because of a recent change in the law, the situation has changed for your country. For instance, of the countries that we heard today, Spain is in the first category mentioned, France and Portugal in the second, and Italy in the third. For the number of, so next slide, please. For the number of European accreditation procedures that are carried out, you can also have a look at the DICA, which is the database of ECA, where the different decisions of the agencies that are included in DICA are listed. Then this mentions 20 procedures according to the European approach, so that have been carried out, and where there is a conclusion, a decision, and where it's published in DICA. But probably the number is higher because it requires, for instance, that it is also recognizable as an procedure that has been carried out with the European approach, which may not always be the case. I know of at least one procedure that is not listed in DICA as a European approach, although the procedure itself is in DICA. And then also not all agencies and therefore not all countries are included yet in DICA. So I think it would be probably more closer to 30, maybe even beyond that. This number will also increase, of course, because of the European University Initiative and also the European degrees. And it was already mentioned, the relationship with the European approach also in the call, that was also mentioned. So this is likely to go to go up further. And lastly, I think it's you can also find the reference on the ECA website that there is a European approach online toolkit. So this is quite interesting for all the institutions that are considering to undertake a procedure according to the European approach, because this is a guide, really, an online guide that really has a lot of information, and also short videos and all kinds of text, and also a template, for instance, if you want to use that for the self-evaluation report. This is a result of the EU-funded IMPIA project. You see the link here. So that was very briefly what I to say about the European approach. So I'm looking forward to your questions and to have a dialogue about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for a very, very clear presentation of the European approach, and those links to, in particular, the ECA website, where there is a wealth of information. We are running a little behind schedule, but we would like to have some time for questions and answers. So we'll say about 10 minutes, perhaps, so that we can at least address the questions in the Q&A box. For the moment, there is one, and it is one for the panelists in general. It comes from Andries Verspeten at Ghent University. And it is, apart from thanking you all for your interesting presentations, from a QA perspective, what are your views or expectations on the potential impact of the work currently being done on the joint European degree label, as you know, the essence of the EDLab project, as a follow-up to earlier European Union driven impulses, for example, Erasmus Mundus or the European University Alliance Initiative. So any views from any of our speakers on the label, the European degree label, as a step towards joint European degrees? I think Marilena.
Yes, I just wanted to underline a very practical aspect of all the work which is being done, which is very practical, but I think it is also very important. And it is the need to have reliable and updated data on what is going on at an international, at a European level concerning joint degrees, concerning the application of the European approach. As Mark has just said, we don't even know exactly which is the number of the European approaches which has been applied, and more generally, reliable information and data, updated data on what is going on within the alliances and their development. I know that there are spontaneous initiatives to monitor that, like website, at least one that I know. But I think that in the near future, starting from now, these initiatives concerning the label can really be very useful to have a really European framework of concerning what is going on in all the different contexts, because this is actually necessary if we really want to develop something which is common, which is European. And also what Mark was saying about how much is really possible, already possible, to have completely joint criteria for the assessment of the joint programs, and which is the degree of flexibility that we might have to take into account to make the European approach or an evolved version of the European approach really applicable in the context in which we want to apply it. Let me just make the example of Italy. In general, there is no real main difficulty in adopting European approach criteria to the assessment of joint programs, including Italian universities. I would say, except for one main requirement that we would like to keep as an additional requirement or to share as a requirement with the other institutions from different countries, which is a requirement concerning the quality and number of the faculty involved in the delivery of the program. This is at a national level. It is an important requirement. It is set by law. If we want to start a new program, there has to be a certain number of faculty members guaranteeing for it, not only from a quantitative point of view, but also concerning the scientific quality of the staff, which is measured according to specific criteria in Italy and probably differently in other countries. But I mean, back to my main point. My main point is really it is necessary, and it is very useful also at this level of this first webinar to collect data, to know each other really in depth, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marilena. I think if you don't mind, we'll move on to the other two questions which we currently have. We now have more. So first question from Estela Lleida. Are governments working in order to align policies to facilitate the preparation of joint programmes? I wonder if any of our panelists, perhaps the ministerial representatives, would like to respond to that.
I would say, yeah, I would say that unfortunately not enough to be positive. I mean, therefore, I thank this opportunity to go to know, because there's no stable place where we can meet and we can discuss this sometimes very technical issues. And for example, now, as you know, we will have the presidency of the European Council in the second semester of this. We will try, to meet and to discuss, but the issues are so many that it should be a permanent relationship, a permanent place where we can meet at technical level, and then also, of course, at political level. And unfortunately, this doesn't exist as stable as it should be.
Thank you, Arqus. I think indeed it is very interesting that the 6 pilots are hoping to offer a forum for further dialogue amongst the ministries, amongst the agencies, and between the agencies, the ministries, and the universities and the alliance. Absolutely essential. We have a question now from Marta Pardal. I'm sorry, maybe it's Maria. The letters are a little bit too small. Maria, sorry. Maria asks what we as institutions who are members of European alliances can do to try to work towards this common European framework when it comes to quality assurance. Is there anything that any of the panelists would recommend us as universities in alliances to do? Would any of you like to respond to that? Maria, would anyone like to respond to Maria's question? Or shall I perhaps, Sarah? Thank you.
It's a question about, sorry, I didn't quite hear the question, but I understood that it was about what the alliances can do to speed the European approach. But I would just say in having listened recently to about 10 or 11 alliances of the many that exist in France, talking about their how they're getting on, giving a kind of feedback on their progress. I would say that they are, in some ways, alliances are the kind of crucible. They're the place where all of this is happening, and where, in a sense, experimentation is moving forward, and hopefully that those experiments, the ones that work, will then become policy and reglementation. I don't know how the other countries have see the alliances, but I think it's there that we're going to see them more and more good thinking, because they do meet. That's my point, going back to what was just said by Marcus, that there is a need for that regularity of data, and also what Marilena was saying about this need for constant data and updates. I think that the alliances do furnish that, but I'd be interested to hear what other panelists think about that, if it's true.
Thank you, Sarah. I think Laura wanted to comment there.
Yes, if I can just add to that, I think from the perspective of the alliances, obviously it's in all of our interests to move forward in these respects, but we mustn't forget that we are also under a lot of time pressure, and that we have to produce these programs, as was stated in our project proposals. And so sometimes you can only push for a certain length of time before you have to look for alternative ways to move forward and come up with the results that you need to come up with in order to fulfill the requirements of your project. So I think we need to make our voices heard as much as possible in order to get the changes underway in the time frame that we have to move forward, and that we don't end up not using the European approach because some of the partners in our alliance are not able to have that recognized, and that we don't find alternative ways. So making using forums such as this and opportunities such as these pilot European degree label forums to really put the issues on the table, bring together the necessary actors, and really just don't stop knocking at doors and shouting about the need to align the procedures in the different countries.
Thank you, Laura. And Mark, I think also wants to comment on this.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I just want to underline that I think it's really the time pressure is of course a challenge, but on the other hand, it also can push things, and I think it's very important. These projects, European degree projects, are also, when it comes to the European approach and the implementation of the European approach, it's very important that there is so much that there is pressure, and there's also eagerness, I think, to succeed in that. And because if you look at the European approach, it was the ministers approved it in 2015, which is now 8 years ago. So you can say, okay, the number of these procedures is still small. On the other hand, we know that in Bologna process, sometimes it can take a lot of effort and a lot of time. But it is important really to have initiatives that can really speed things up. And I think the European universities initiatives and the European degree pilot projects are very important in that respect. Also for the other joint programs that outside of the which are not organized by an alliance, but which would also benefit from using the European approach, and they can also benefit if the transformation that goes out from the European University Initiative and the European degrees leads also to positive results and can speed things up also for others. So I think it's very important in that respect. And but I of course know that you have to do a lot of work in a very short time, and that's a challenge. And I hope that from quality assurance agencies we can support you in that as much as possible. And I think it's very good also to have agencies and national authorities also included as associate partners. So that's also a good way to move forward, I think. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have time pressure also here, but I think if we can try to address the 3 questions we currently have in the question and answer box. The first comes from Ulrike Gravagna in Graz. And she says it is paradoxical that academic degrees are recognized without problems from one country to another. When a graduate applies for PhD admission, for example, at another institution, but not the accreditation processes. It's always necessary that joint programs are approved in all national systems. And she asks why in joint programs is it not possible to delegate this process to one country or to find a common procedure? I think that's the question that's been underlying the entire discussion this morning. So I don't know if any of you would like to comment on this paradox.
Well, just to say, Dorothy, that perhaps we shouldn't say it too loudly, or we might find that instead of resolving the accreditation issue, that something is done to roll back the recognition of qualifications across the European area. That would certainly not be in our interest. But yes, it is a situation that, if you analyze it, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that common procedure does exist. It's the European approach. It's a question of how we convince the countries, those many countries, the 19 where it's not available and the 11 where it's only partially available, to make the necessary changes to their national legislation in order to be able to apply it.
Thank you, Laura. I like to think that recognition of degrees is now something that we will not move backwards on. I think Patricia wants to comment on that question.
Well, I was just going to say that we need to find a supranational way of understanding each other, all participating countries, because as it was said, in some of them it is accepted, in other ones they aren't. So we need a common framework at the European level for us to all abide by the procedure. And even if that that legislation truthfully has to be transcripted into the national countries, but there should be an opening, a common platform in such a way that the European approach is recognized by the majority of national accreditation agencies.
Thank you, Patricia. We have two further questions. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take the last one first. Pablo Pulido from here in Granada asks, how can coordination across European evaluation and accreditation systems be promoted? Perhaps a question for the agencies. I think quite a lot of work is already being done by ENQA and by ECAR. Marilena?
Yes, this is exactly what I wanted to do. Much work has been done. I think that an effort should be always put in the direction. I know it's not always possible. I know it's not always easy, but I think that agencies and ministries should always, for each of the participating countries, sit together at the same tables. Then they can also have separate tables for agencies and for ministries, but there have to be also occasions in which really both the stakeholders are there together. I know this is difficult. I know that it is not always possible, but I think this is crucial also.
Thank you, Marilena. And perhaps can we take Pablo's first, now second question as a sort of a last tour de table? What do you think the specific challenges are in the 4 focus countries of the EDLab project? And I think perhaps just to be a little bit more specific, given the time, very little time we have available, could I ask each of the representatives of the 4 national contexts to identify one major challenge? Maybe if we start, Sarah, with you, is there one major challenge in the French context that you would identify in order to facilitate joint degrees?
I think the major change would be to get a real sort of government will to get it going. It's going back a little bit to what we were saying, the question earlier about our governments really doing everything they can. I think there's a definite desire to do that, a definite idea that we should facilitate. But I think the challenge is to perhaps just make sure that everyone realizes the importance, the social importance, the educational importance, the political importance of moving this forward. That it's not just another question of more administration. But I'm sort of saying that in a sense, it's a kind of a work of communication within each country to make sure that everyone is really understanding what the stakes are. That's what I would say. So it's at the same time governmental and also a governmental push to create understanding.
Thank you, Sarah. Marilena, what would you identify as one major challenge?
Of course, I fully agree with what Sarah's just said. Common shared awareness is a basis for everything. And well, for Italy, of course, there's the main issue of being admitted in the ECHO register, which is something we are working for having quite soon, hopefully.
Thank you, Marilena. Patricia from the Portuguese agency.
I think currently our biggest challenge is actually to make possible the uploaded of the self-evaluation report, because in terms of legislation, I think our way is opened to accept different criteria coming from the partner institutions. So I would say that's the main hiccup.
A very practical hiccup there.
Yes.
And I think it's a real combination of factors here, isn't there? And Marcos from Spain, what would you identify as the major challenge? Sorry, Marcos, did you hear me?
No, sorry. I had to, as you know, I'm sorry, but I have to be in 2 meetings at the same time, and I wasn't able to listen to your question. Can you repeat, please?
I apologize, just very, very quickly. What would you identify as the major challenge in the Spanish context now to move forward in joint degrees?
Well, although we already introduced flexibility in the rules, I think we can improve in the implementation of these rules. And then, as I mentioned before, we should try to push that also regional and national agencies have a very positive and active participation in the implementation of the European approach.
Thank you very much indeed. And perhaps Mark from another context, from the Dutch-Flemish context, would you like to comment just to close this final round?
I think from the Flemish side, we don't really, it's the European approach is also in the law, and there's not any problem, anything that I can think of. On the Dutch side, it's well, there is for existing programs, there is a check on the thesis. So there is a number of 15 theses that the panel has to look at. That is also the case when the European approach is European approach procedures is carried out. So that is something that is still there. So I think it would be better if that would be if that would be, because you can say that is also a little bit adding from a national side, although you could also say it's a demonstration of the achievement. But anyway, so that's I think there are always things that you can even further improve on that side. So
thank you very much indeed, Mark. We have a couple of participants who would like to speak very briefly, given that we have approximately 4 minutes left before we reach the 2 hours. One is a professor from the University of Padua. I think it's the University of Padua who needs to give her the floor, because normally it's only the panelists who were going to participate, but please.
Yes, she has the floor.
Sorry, thank you so much. And sorry, I saw the possibility of raising hand, so I thought I would prefer to speak. I had more comment than an answer. This is the reason why I wanted to speak. First of all, thanks to the panelists. And I'm a coordinator of the international degree in forestry in forest science in Padua. And also we embed some double degree Erasmus Mundus program. So I wanted to bring my voice from the grassroots, which I think it's important. We've been running this program, double degree program, for at least 10 years. So we have accumulated quite a lot of experience. And one comment I wanted to make is that I've been hearing talking about flexibility, and I think it's a key word today. But what we experience at the moment is really unflexibility. We are struggling every day with a lot of maybe details, but which are really important. And I would like to mention just a couple of them, because I think it's important that you also, listen from experiences of what we experience every day in our life. These double degree are run with the Spanish and Portuguese institutions. So it's the right audience here. Just for example, a couple of examples that I want to make is that, for example, in our accreditation system in Italy, we accreditate the framework of the degree. In Portuguese institution, we accreditate the list of exams. So our accreditation systems ask us to update adjust the list of exams every year to comply with the improvement required by the accreditation system. This is not possible with the accreditation that we have in Portuguese countries, so we are struggling with that every day. We cannot change and adjust and improve. Other aspects is that, for example, we don't grade some activities, but the accreditation systems in Portuguese and Spanish, they also always ask for grades. So these are just a couple of examples. I can make a whole list, and I know I have no time, but just I wanted to make the point that I think it's important to listen to cases, study cases, gather data from the grassroots to understand really where the problems are and how we can overcome them, because we are really losing, we're investing a lot of time in administrative procedures that are really big barriers for us. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Professor Dieto. And in actual fact, I should say that part of the EDLab project is to collect experiences, obstacles, and issues. We will be preparing a detailed report on all of these issues, which we will then, within the project, be able to share in focus group meetings, face-to-face, we hope, with the national authorities, with the quality assurance agencies who are working with us as associate partners. That is the whole objective of this project. So thank you very much indeed, and we do indeed count on your input and the input from all our joint program coordinators so that we can identify absolutely all of these issues. And I think,
in fact, Dorothy, sorry, could I just jump in there just to say that many of you will have already answered the second survey, which provides an opportunity to give opinions and suggestions for the criteria. It should have closed yesterday, but those of you who maybe started and didn't get around to finishing, there are quite a lot of unfinished answers. Maybe, I'm sure you'll be very happy to hear that we are going to leave it open until first thing Monday morning. So if you started answering the survey, the second EDLab survey on the criteria, and you didn't get round to finishing and submitting it, now is your chance. You have a whole weekend ahead where you can complete the survey and give us this data, this information that will be very useful as we move forward. Thought I'd just get that in. Sorry to interrupt, Dorothy.
Your pitch in, that's well done, I think. Thank you. It's very, very important for the project that we should have as much input as possible. Very, very important. So thank you very much indeed. I think given that it is now midday and we have gone about 30 minutes over our original timing proposal, I think this is an indication of the interest that we all have and of the complexity also of the issues on the table. So I would like to thank all of our speakers from agencies, from ministries, from the project itself for this webinar. I would like to remind everyone that the webinar will be available on the EDLab YouTube channel, so that colleagues who have not been able to join can also hear the discussions. I would like to remind you that there will be a third webinar on digital certification in the autumn, probably in the month of October, with the participation of Chimea and led by our partners from the Enlight Alliance at Ghent University. I would like to thank the team at the University of Padua for organising the webinar and for their excellent work in the dissemination of the EDLab project in general. And if you will allow me, just as a concluding remark, I would like to play a little with the metaphors which our various alliances use. Laura started by talking about a choppy sea from CEU. In Arqus, we like to talk about building, Arqus arch architecture, building bridges in order to move forward. In our next webinar, as I said, Enlight will be leading the issue on digital certification. Enlight uses the lighthouse as their symbol of how to move forward with a very long-term view of the horizon. And I think we all agree that that is what we need to do. And just to close utopia, rather than a utopia as such, I think it's true that we in the alliances all do have a vision of the future, a dream that working together, I'm sure we can make come true. Thank you all very, very much indeed. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of you at all different levels in as many fora as possible in order to move forward together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.